Hello, my name is Adrian Martinez, and I'm going to be doing a brief lecture about Robert Mapplethorpe and the question of ethics within his photography. Now, especially with the massive backlash he received towards the end of his life around his work, I wanted to know whether Mapplethorpe's work was morally and ethically justified, or if it was more harmful for the public consciousness than it was ever worth making. This is inspired heavily by our discussion around Tidigit follies early on in the semester and the idea of competing rights in the act of publishing artwork. How important is consent for both subject and audience? To be doing this, I'm going to be going into Mapplethorpe's work with women and children, queerness and explicit sex acts, and race. Mapplethorpe was largely concerned with the idea of photographing people as he saw them and how he believed that they were. So a lot of his early work featured his one-time roommate and lifelong friend and one-time lover, Patti Smith. Despite their once romantic relationship, the photos of her were all dignified and honest. Even a nude of Smith kneeling upright in front of a sink with the blindfold on manages to avoid any degree of raunchiness. Sure, it's provocative and striking, but it could never be considered pornographic. It's intimacy done correctly because that was the nature of their relationship, and that's how he saw them, and by extension, how he saw her. Mapplethorpe also produced a series of works titled Lady Lisa Lyon in collaboration with Lisa Lyon, who was the first world women's bodybuilding champion in 1980. His photos of her were not as masculine and muscular as one might expect traditional bodybuilding photos to be, but they also weren't nearly as soft and feminine as one might expect photos of just women to be. There were bulging muscles and armpit hair, as well as satin and undergarments. And the reason for his display of both Smith and Lyon is because he didn't see them as sex objects, he saw them in their entirety as he got to know them as models and as people. And a review by Bruce Chatwin of Lady Lisa Lyon says the photographer and his model have conspired to tell a story of their overlapping obsessions. Their glorification of the body is an act of will, a defiance of nihilism and abstraction, a story of the modern movement in reverse. Now, a brief note on children. Mapplethorpe was actually lauded for his photography of children as it was playful and real, which was hard to do for many of the time, as opposed to his normally highly stylized and formal photography. His works featuring children made an effort to be light, innocent, and relaxed. Children, as well as the rest of Robert's models, were usually depicted in the clothing they wore into the studio that day. He emphasized consent, comfort, and participation, especially with the children, many of which belonged to relatives or hometown friends. There's a photograph featuring a little girl named Lindsay Key, uh, barefoot with a white dress, hair flowing in the wind, which emphasizes the innocence and light juxtaposed from the shadowy brick wall behind her. But I wanted to emphasize a quote regarding somebody's child viewing Mapplethorpe's more explicit work within a gallery in the future. Now, this is by Catherine Flett of The Guardian, and she says, but perhaps there's some sort of sliding scale of child appropriate art, and even if I don't yet want to talk to my children about S&M, maybe I ought to be engaging them in a dialogue about the bloodier aspects of war, especially as they are male children enthralled to the whole idea and indeed the actuality of fighting. Now, this really brings up the idea of whether consent matters if the audience is viewing the work outside of its original context, and can an artist ever really prevent prying eyes from viewing their work? Moving on to queerness and explicit sex acts in photography. Though not nearly as demonized as his sexually explicit work, Mapplethorpe dabbled with depictions and representations of traditional gender and breaking those norms. Obviously, we already saw that with the androgyny of Patti Smith and the challenge of gender norms with Lisa Lyon. But he also frequently experimented with different aspects of his own identity in his self-portraiture, often hardening or softening features to match what he felt about himself then. Um, Plenty of lipstick and makeup, as well as going the opposite direction, wearing biker jackets and more tough manly gear. Much of the moral outrage around Mapplethorpe's art, at least the bulk of it originally, was because of depictions of gay sex, particularly when it portrayed fetish gear and leather. There was an exhibition titled The Perfect Moment, which sparked moral outrage at several exhibits, with varying reactions by those running the exhibits. There's a lot of canceled shows, and a good amount of them actually did hold strong and show the exhibition anyway. But specifically, the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, which was sued and found not guilty by a jury. And this was important because this exhibition was made with public funds, which sparked the debate, should tax dollars support the arts? Unfortunately, it's impossible to separate the rising support and openness of '80s queer culture from the AIDS crisis, and of course, it's even more impossible to separate New York art culture from AIDS as well. Unfortunately, Mapplethorpe was a victim, eventually dying in 1989. Yet his work and public resistance to it both have enjoyed plenty of exposure since. Much of the rhetoric about AIDS victims was irresponsibly inaccurate and made it out to be a gay disease, equating queerness with divine punishment. So, in the American consciousness, the question becomes, do photographic depictions of explicit acts that violate the religious teachings of many Americans have a right to be funded publicly if they break those religious teachings? Now, on to what I think is the most valid criticism of Mapplethorpe's work, the black body and the rebuttal towards his depiction. Mapplethorpe photographed black men quite extensively. However, these people were often models, dancers, and bodybuilders, always with muscular, fit bodies. In his 1986 work, Black Book, many pieces were simply of black torsos, thighs, buttocks, or other singular body parts. He's quoted saying, I zero in on the body part that I consider the most perfect part in that particular model. Many of those were of his lover, Jack Wall, who was later interviewed. Though not criminally or intentionally racist, his photography like this harmful to black people as a whole, especially with inspirations like Mandingo, which oversexualize and reduce black men to overtly masculine sexual objects. In a 2023 interview with Jack Walls, who was Mapplethorpe's lover at the time of his death, um, they asked questions regarding Wall's thoughts on race within and around his life with Mapplethorpe. Walls is obviously black and extremely open about the racism among gay men in 1970s to 80s New York. Um, he accounts at a time in Fire Island where white dudes who were into black dudes were called dinge queens. When asked about a 1995 biography by Patricia Morris Rowe, Jack seemed outraged at the reduction of his lived experience with Mapplethorpe. And just to demonstrate a snippet of the interview that I've just mentioned, the interviewer begins, well, in fact, to jump right into that, in your 1995 biography of Mapplethorpe, Patricia Morris Rowe goes into great detail about how much he used the N-word, both with white friends and with black men during sex, and about how he would go to black gay bars like Keller's looking for a certain type of, in his words, primitive black man. Didn't that turn you off? And then Jack responds, that's the takeaway you got from that book? Because that book, frankly, is a piece of shit. Walls wasn't happy with this depiction of Mapplethorpe, even with the admittedly racist behavior, especially by our standards today, because he believed that reduced Mapplethorpe's character and his art into what it was being labeled as racism, rather than the lived experience of people at the time and how he honestly viewed people. I think that, especially by today's standards, you could call a lot of Mapplethorpe's behavior and a lot of how he depicted and even treated black men at the time as racist. Um, but I think the artistic value he brings in his honest experience as a gay man at the time, especially with close relationships with black men, does offer a lot of input we might never get again because it's from a biased perspective and we see people how he sees them as I've been saying the whole time. Now, after all that exposition, it's time to answer whether Mapplethorpe's work was actually harmful for the public consciousness. Now, Mapplethorpe often shocked those who witnessed his art by confronting the morality and expectation of art. He played with themes and ideals that weren't publicly accepted and were often directly at odds with the popular American consciousness. And they're not intentionally racist. The Black Book can credibly be seen as a product of a harmful understanding of the black body, especially among gay men. It's artistically beautiful, but definitely ambiguous in motivation. So I believe that the emphasis on consent demonstrated by Mapplethorpe time and again makes a world of difference. The most important rights are those of the subject of the art, as was emphasized in the debates over Titigit Follies. It's good that art is challenged because that's what gives it value. I wouldn't have learned to appreciate Mapplethorpe's work if the discussion around it hadn't been so prominent. When acceptability is called into question, strides are made in public discussion, and after everything, Mapplethorpe was a pioneer in photography as art, and as long as it's not physically harming anyone, his work is important precisely because of this honesty and bias put into it. Public perception and scrutiny of art is good because the more divisive it is, the more the conversation needs to happen. So, to answer the question that I put forth at the beginning of this, yes, I think that Mapplethorpe's art was justified ethically and morally. I think the only real arguments you can make against it are regarding race and those regarding satanic panic or outrage over queerness being explicitly in artwork or children seeing work in general in exhibitions um, isn't valid. And at the end of the day, we are given a unique perspective from a man who lived in a time where many others died, and we've lost their perspective.